Thank you very much. Thank you, Chiara, for the introduction. We go back a long time, and so it's really nice to be here at this interesting conference, which is indeed, as you say, it's one of these occasions where the lawyers working for the EU institutions and academics meet and talk to each other. So that I think it's a good thing, and maybe it should happen even more than it does. But this certainly the ECB is doing a great job in this. So I will chair this first panel, which is about building budgetary autonomy. And in a sense, in a very narrow sense, the European Union, of course, has always had budgetary autonomy, meaning that the budget is being approved by EU institutions, it's being implemented by EU institutions, and so on. But that's not what is meant here, obviously. What is meant here with the idea of building EU's budgetary autonomy is that we need to rethink the current system, and we need to think of autonomy more in the sense, not in the formal sense of who decides the budget, but in the substantive sense, namely whether the budget allows the European Union to do the things it needs to do. That is to say, whether the budget supports the EU's capacity to act. And what we've seen in recent years is a growing attention for what is sometimes called governing through funding. That is to say that the main way in which the European Union used to deliver its policies is through rulemaking. We all know that, legislation and executive acts. But in recent years, funding, money, has become more central as a tool of governance, as an instrument for the EU to achieve its policy goals. And why is that? I think it's in part because some policy objectives of the EU simply cannot be achieved through rules, but can only be achieved through money, through funding. Think, of course, of what happened with the sovereign debt crisis, but also what is nowadays called the delivery of European public goods, such as climate and digital transition, obviously require money and not just rules. It's also, I think, this new emphasis on governing through funding is also linked to the fact that the treaty rules sometimes hinder the achievement of policy goals in the normal way. And here I think of what Chiara mentioned here, the rule of law crisis. Since the way the treaty organizes the reactions to rule of law backsliding isn't very effective, what we've seen is that funding tools have been used as an indirect way of trying to achieve that. And that's going to be discussed later today. But as a result of that, what we have seen is an expansion of funding instruments of the EU, but also a lot of fragmentation. And sometimes the term budgetary galaxy is used to describe that. Because the budget itself of the EU has remained what it has always been, basically. No, it's relatively small. It hasn't changed much in its content. But what we have seen over the course of the years is the emergence of other sources of funding. And just mention, I will just list them, but they will be discussed, of course, later on. The European Stability Mechanism, which was created as a big pot of money outside the budget. It's a dormant pot of money, of course, for the time being. NextGenerationEU, with what has been called a temporary second budget for the European Union for the past 5 years, created outside the normal budget through borrowing. The creation of EU policy tools funded by member state contributions, which is also an interesting development. The European Peace Facility was mentioned by Chiara. That's an example, no, where it's an EU policy, but the money comes from the member states, so outside the EU budget, etc., etc. Not to forget, of course, the European Central Bank itself, with its non-conventional monetary policy, which has been a very important way of governing through funding over the years, not least in the context of the post-COVID crisis. So we have this very complex picture. It's not very satisfactory, and that's, I think, where the discussion of today starts. We need to think of building a more stable European budgetary autonomy to support the EU's capacity to act. And that's where discussions come in on the development of a more permanent common European debt mechanism, discussions also on new own resources, discussions on whether the European Union has the power to tax and things like that. I will stop here and I will let our speakers develop some of these points. I will just introduce very briefly our three speakers. All three of them are really excellent choices for dealing with this because they have worked a lot on aspects of European funding and European budgets. So on my left is Cristina Fasone, who's associate professor at LUIS in Rome of constitutional law. And she has looked in her writings at both at the Euro crisis, but also at the post-COVID reaction of the EU from a constitutional perspective, especially looking at the role of national and European Parliament and at questions of accountability of how all this money is being spent by the EU or outside the EU framework. To my right is Alberto de Gregorio Merino, who is a director of the legal service at the legal service of the Commission in charge of internal market law. But until recently, he was at the on the other side of the square in the Council legal service, where he played an important role in developing the EU's legal reaction to the Euro crisis first, and then later on also to the COVID crisis. He was in the machine room there to develop the legal solutions which have been found. And so he will, I think, in his intervention, return a little bit to his old job rather than to internal market law, although you might deal with both. And then we have Paul Dermine, who's professor of European law at the Université Libre de Bruxelles, who's worked extensively on aspects of EMU law, working on the Stability and Growth Pact and its reform, but also he published a monograph on the NextGenerationEU policy of the European Union. So he's been looking at many different aspects. So I will now give the floor to our speakers, starting with Alberto de Gregorio, whose paper will be the more general one, after which we will then move to Paul and then to Cristina. So Alberto, you've got the floor.
Thank you, Bruno, and good morning to everyone. Thanks to Chiara and the colleagues of the ECB for having organized this extraordinary event, as always. It's a pleasure for me to be such a fine company at this side of the table and at the other side of the table. Let me probably start with some introductory remarks on the subject of all this conference, not only on this panel, which is the issue of autonomy and independence. Independence is the word which starts to be used in the Commission, by the way, more than even autonomy. I could say that since 2009, with the situation of perma-crisis, we have developed a law of emergency in the law of the Union. We have reacted to all the crises through unprecedented solutions with a very evolutive reading of the treaties, which remain the same since the Treaty of Lisbon, with the appearance, as I was saying, of a sort of emergency law. In the last FIDE Congress, in which many of you participated, we had one of the panels dealing with emergency law. We have the privilege to have with us the institutional rapporteur of that panel, who will come later, if I'm not wrong, in another panel, Emanuele Rebasti. Now, what's going to happen next in terms of development of the law of the Union and of EU action? I think we will still have many crises. It's our daily bread and butter, I fear. But I think that Union action, and hence the law of the Union, will evolve towards the idea of autonomy and independence. In a situation of geopolitical volatility, where reliance in past alliance are not anymore guaranteed, independence and autonomy are an imperative. The challenge is going to be, for me, to transform juntural solutions that we have adopted during the crisis situations into permanent structures, which are called to cater for the needs of autonomy and independence. And this, by the way, underscores the wisdom of the choice of the subject of this conference. And thanks again, I repeat, to Chiara and the colleagues of the ECB for this. The President of the Commission has so stated in her speech on 29th May of this year, when she received the Charlemagne Prize from the hands of the King of Spain. I read, she said, "Thus I believe that our next great era is about building an independent Europe. We cannot allow ourselves to be thrown off course by the seismic changes that we are facing. once again fall for the fallacy that the storm will pass. No, it will not, because the geopolitical cross currents are strong. Now, the requirements of autonomy and of independence apply in many areas where we need to rely on our own means for existential policies. And there are a lot of them, many of which are going to be discussed in the coming 2 days. It is defense, it is internal market, it is competitiveness, it is trade, it is energy, it is pharma. It is the values of the Union, which are the basis of our constitutional identity and autonomy. And I will say a word at the end of my presentation on this. It is the monetary policy, it is the digital euro, a project which is so dear to this house and to my house and to the Commission. And it is, of course, also budgetary and financial autonomy. And now I'm going to go to the very subject of the panel, and I will try to examine that with 3 issues or 3 questions that I'm going to assess in turn. The first one is whether it is possible to have a European treasury on a permanent basis. Is it possible under the current treaties? The second question is whether it is possible for the Union to establish a capacity to raise taxes or fiscal contributions from individual companies. And the third issue I want to tackle with you is the link between values and budget as an imperative of autonomy of the Union. I will be extremely brief. So sorry if I am simplistic sometimes, but this is to cater to spark, as Kaya was saying, the discussion with you in a few minutes' time. I will go with the 2 first questions. European Common Treasury and EU taxing capacity. And what I will be doing, it will be a thread in my intervention, is to mark the differences between the features of the budget and the financial capacity of the Union of Member States, which describe very well the limits to our financial and budgetary autonomy. And the first thing I wanted to say is that nation states, member states, finance themselves through 2 main sources, which is taxes and issuance of debt. The Union traditionally has not applied taxes to individuals or companies, and the Union, with the exception of Next Generation, has not issued debt to finance expenditure. The Union acts when it comes to its budget and to financial power in the framework of their own resources decision, whereby member states are held to transfer amounts to the Union with a limit that the Council and the member states mark themselves. Now, is it possible to create a European treasury on a permanent basis? The first question I wanted to tackle. And I will go back to the making of Next Generation, which, as you know, was the first time where we issued 750 billion euros in the markets to finance the economic consequences of COVID-19, out of which 338 billion were for financing grants. It was debt for financing expenditure, borrowing for expenditure. And this was a question which many member states put around the table at the level of the European Council. Is this possible? They were not only worried by the budgetary consequences of this. We see today we have to pay 25 billion euros per year to cover the interest, but also because many of them saw in this new borrowing capacity a seed, an embryo of a debt, of a Hamiltonian project, which could have a federalization strength, which many fear, and ultimately raise questions of democratic legitimacy. The question is still today on the table. You yourself said in the Draghi report, you have a very vehement call for a common debt. He himself repeated that in Rimini 10 days ago. Prime Minister Sanchez has been insisting on this in the margins of the European Council when it is about financing defense. Now, there are probably 2 constitutional limits stemming from the treaties to the capacity of the Union to borrow, to do borrowing for spending. And I will examine them in turn, very briefly. The first one is the so-called principle of budgetary balance. Article 310 of the TFEU reads as follows: the revenue and expenditure shown in the budget shall be in balance. Shall be in balance. It is a fundamental principle of financial and budgetary law, and it's not only a technical arcane of the Union, it's a basic fundamental and constitutional principle of budget law of the Union. As a difference to member states, and insisting in these differences, member states, as you know, can incur in deficits with the limits of the Stability and Growth Pact, with the limits of possible debt breaks in member states, but they can do so. The Union must have, at the end of each year, a budget in balance. Any deficit must be financed the next year by virtue of the own resources decision, automatically corrected. Now, how was this addressed at the Next Generation operation, whereby we issue 338 billion euros, which is indeed a deficit. There was a creative idea, which was put on the table by the legal community of the Commission of the Council, which consisted in creating in the own resources decision a compartment, a 0.6 GNA compartment, whereby member states irrevocably, definitively, and enforceably commit to guarantee the payment of all these amounts before the market. So look at a multi-annual perspective. This operation is budgetary neutral because we have an asset, the 0.6 I referred to, which compensates the liability of the 338 billion euros. So first limit is the principle of budgetary balance. The second limit to the budgetary autonomy of the union when borrowing is, I would say, the principle of integrity of the own resources system. And I go back to the treaties. Article 311 of the treaties lay down that without prejudice to other revenue, the budget shall be financed wholly from own resources. And I underline the adverb wholly from own resources. Now, the monies of borrowings in next generation are not own resources of the union. Own resources, there is not a definition in the treaties of what is an own resource, but they have been classically conceived as revocable and definitive rights of payment towards the union. Now, the borrowings, the proceeds of borrowing next generation are a liability against the market, which is not owed to the union, so they are not own resources. So how to square the cycle here? How does 750 billion euros respect the integrity of the own resources system? Because the treaties tell to us that we have to wholly finance it on the own resources system of the union. This is, again, a very constitutional question of budgetary autonomy of the union. Why? Because the treaties are built on a preponderance, on the idea of preponderance of financing by the own resources system. The union cannot finance itself as it sees fit. It finances itself in accordance with the own resources decision, where member states agree to transfer monies to the union. It's one of the few, I think even the only, act of secondary law of the union which, entering into force, is subject to an act of acceptance of member states. Now, how was this addressed in next generation? How does 750 billion euros, which is more than the half than the whole MFF for this period, respect this integrity of finance in the own resources system? A question which was very important also before the German Constitutional Court in 2020, when it examined the compatibility of next generation with the German Constitution. The way this was examined and reflecting the recitals of the own resources decision at that time, and to some extent also in the judgment of the German Constitutional Court, was to make, I would say, a qualitative assessment, not a quantitative one. To say, in a juncture where we have to address one of the most deep economic crises since the Second World War, 750 billion euros can be proportionate and supplementary to the MFF. Yet, it has to come with guarantees. It must be a crisis mechanism. It must be limited in time. Next generation must die in year 2026. And it must also be used only, those borrowings, for a sole purpose of financing the economic consequence of COVID-19. You cannot use this for finance defense, even if there have been some temptations to do so. It must be extremely earmarked to finance the consequence of COVID-19, and under these circumstances, it was conceived as supplementary in this exceptional crisis framework to the own resources decision. Now, I have to conclude in this first question, and I will be much faster, I promise, Bruno, in the other two, that there are substantial limits to upgrade the borrowing capacity of the union into a permanent system. So I fear that with the current treaties, we have to stick to crisis mechanism. And actually, you see that in the new MFF proposals, we have no borrowing for spending for the time being. Let's see how the discussion evolves in the coming months and years. There's only a crisis mechanism, but which is back-to-back lending. So the union is authorized to go to the markets in cases of unexpected crisis to finance loans lending to member states. Very briefly on the second question, which I think also my friend Paul will target in a couple of minutes, which is whether it is possible for the union to directly raise taxes and fiscal contributions for member states. Now, I told to you some minutes ago that up to now, there have been no direct taxing on individuals and companies by the union. We've got in the past sugar levies. We've got in the past milk levies, agricultural levies. We've got banking contributions in the Single Resolution Fund. but these are very specific contributions in a particular regulatory framework to allow the functioning of a particular market or sector of the economy. They cannot be conceived as fiscal contributions, and so the court has stated, for example, in relation to the banking contribution of the SRF, of the Single Resolution Fund. But outside this framework, never the union has imposed directly taxes on individuals. And this brings me to an idea, which is that in spite of being in year 2021, own resources exist basically almost since the Treaty of Rome, the own resources of the union are not so own. I think we are still in a situation where the union is financed on the basis of transfers from the budgets of the union to the budget of the member states, to the budget of the union. To some extent, we are closer, and take this cum grano salis, and I say with all prudence, to a classical system of finance of an international institution than to a classical system of finance of an Asian state. In my view, but I'm expressing here a very personal view, I take this with a lot of prudence, for the system to evolve toward a real and genuine own resource, we should have to start thinking to progressively give the capacity to the union to raise directly these taxes and fiscal contributions. Is this legally possible? That's a question. I think it is. What is the legal basis? I think Article 311 of the treaty, which is the legal basis to establish the own resources, says two things. The first one, the union shall provide itself with the means necessary to attain its objectives and carry through its policies. Number two, it says, the union may establish new categories of own resources. On this basis, I think, and provided we respect the principle of proportionality and we establish things which are tailor-made for covering our needs and policies, I don't rule out the capacity of the union to establish this new category of resources. And by the way, we have the example now on the table. We have an embryo of a tax in the new MFF proposals of the Commission, where it proposes the Council to establish an annual contribution from companies with annual net turnovers going beyond 100 million euros. It's the so-called corporate resource for Europe, the core, where a lump sum is paid by these companies. So we have now this on the table, and I can tell to you that the legal reflection has been undergoing in the Commission in the last months, and it will continue with member states. And this is going to be one of the main legal discussions that we'll have. Very briefly, to close my intervention, Bruno, I promise a couple of words on values and budgetary autonomy of the union. You insisted very much in that, Chiara, in your presentation, and you rightly did so. In the very seminal judgments of the Court of Justice on Hungary, Poland against Council and Parliament rule of law conditionality, the court said many things. It said one fundamental one, which is probably my favorite one. I had the privilege to be an agent in that case, together, by the way, with my friend Emanuele. And one of the things that the court said in that case was that Article 2, where the 12 values of the union are laid down, inter alia rule of law, but not only, Article 2 are part of the constitutional identity of the union. This is a fundamental development in the case law of the Court of Justice. I think the constitutional identity of the union, the values as constitutional identity of the union, are the substratum for constitutional autonomy and independence. I think the values provide the European Union with an identity that permits it to be autonomous and independent from the constitutional identities of member states and from the values of third states. And it is badly needed at this geopolitical juncture. Now, the European Court of Justice also stated something very important in this judgment, which is that Article 2 has a normative value. It's not just an ornamental provision. It's not only a desideratum of the authors of the treaties. It is obligatory on member states. They have to respect it. And then one of the challenges we EU lawyers have in the coming years, we already have this challenge on the table, is to render Article 2, the values of the Union, which are a semi-ethical but also legal provision, to render this Article 2 operational. And there are two avenues to do so. The first avenue is a judicial one. I'm not going to dwell much on that. Chiara mentioned it. There are plenty of case law when it comes to rule of law. And by the way, I want to draw your attention that for the first time, the Commission has taken a member state to the court with an action for infringement for breaching Article 2 on an autonomous manner, which is the famous LGBTQ case, Commission against Hungary. We have already the opinion of Advocate General Zapeta. We'll have the judgment in short. But also, the second avenue to render Article 2 operational is through legislative means. Because the court has also told to us that Article 2 has a structuring value which is called to irrigate the action of the legislator. This means that when we legislate in any field of the union, values must penetrate action by the legislator. And this is especially seen in the rule of law conditionality instrument, which is fundamental in making alive the values of Article 2, and especially the rule of law. This is an instrument, this is a regulation whereby funds, commitments, payments may be suspended or cancelled if a member state does not respect the rule of law value, because it is considered, this is the underlying idea of this regulation, that in order to have a sound financial management of the monies, member state must respect Article 2 and the rule of law. The intention of the Commission, this is also an important point possibly for our upcoming discussion, is to upgrade this instrument into a much more ambitious one in the next MFF. So respect of the rule of law is not only in this corrective post factum instrument, rule of law conditionality, it will be a condition of eligibility for paying funds when it comes to the new macro cohesion agricultural fund, which is the so-called national regional partnership programs of the Commission, which will be based on targets and milestones, among which the respect of the rule of law. I think I've spoken at length now. Bruno, I will leave it by here. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Alberto, for this tour d'horizon of many things which are going on and which we will be able to discuss later on. And now pass the floor to Paul Dermine. You've got slides, I think, also, Paul. And you will deal with, especially with the question of common debt and the EU budget. You've got the floor.
Thanks a lot, Bruno. And I would also like to join Alberto in thanking Chiara, Michael, and the whole team of the ECB Legal Service for the very kind invitation, which truly honors me, and for putting together this amazing event once again this year. Now, as a starter, I would like to offer you a couple of reminders about the EU budget. Now, as you all know, the EU budget suffers from a number of chronic limitations. Despite its ever-increasing responsibilities, the EU remains a budgetary dwarf, with a budget historically capped at around 1% of EU GDP. The EU budget is a complex and rigid tool, with about 90% of its funds pre-allocated from the start, preventing responsiveness to changing circumstances and priorities. But even more fundamentally, especially for the purpose of this panel, the EU budget only embodies a limited degree of substantive financial autonomy. The EU, as a supranational polity, does exhibit an unprecedented level of political and legal integration, but when it comes to its budget still very much looks like a budget of states, primarily governed by an intergovernmental logic, and in the end, as Alberto said, not so dissimilar to the budget of more traditional international organizations. On the expenditure side, the dominance of the juste retour logic has favored interstate bargaining and has prevented the articulation of EU public finances around genuine European public goods. On the revenue side, the EU system of resources remains desperately underdeveloped and fundamentally dependent on national transfers, and most notably, the so-called GNI-based contribution. This lack of genuine budgetary autonomy is an enduring pattern of the EU, in spite of the promise of Article 311 that the Union shall provide itself with the means necessary to attain its objectives and carry through its policies. As a result of these constraints, and that is something that Bruno mentioned as well, the EU budget and EU public finances, more generally, have only played historically an accessory role in the integration project, historically dominated by a regulatory model and the integration through law paradigm. Now, over the past few years, confronted with several existential challenges and an unprecedented succession of crises, the Union has largely revisited its budgetary system. It has opened new avenues for financial action and given funding a new centrality in its overall policy approach. And common European debt raised through joint borrowings has played a central role in enabling the EU to overcome the status quo and financially rise to the challenge. Just a couple of figures to help you grasp the magnitude of the shift at play. Under the current budgetary cycle, 2/5 of the EU's financial firepower, roughly 800 billion out of 2 trillion, are based on common debt. Since 2021 and the adoption of the recovery plan NextGenerationEU, the EU has raised each year between 100 and 115 billion, 50 billion euros on capital markets, borrowing levels comparable to those of major sovereign issuers in Europe, such as France, Germany, or Italy. Now, in my intervention, I would like to offer a number of reflections on the potential and on the challenges of common debt for the EU polity. What I want to argue is that common debt is a double-edged sword for the Union and for the future of its public finances. On the one hand, debt constitutes a crucial vector of financial autonomy and responsiveness, which enhances the relevance and impact of EU action. But on the other hand, debt also raises challenges and difficulties of its own, which, if not properly managed, could turn it into a source of vulnerability on the longer term. Now, in general, public debt enables political authorities to access financial resources which outgrow their immediate revenue streams. Public debt thereby increases their ability to financially meet their needs and priorities and to react to unforeseen events. It is a genuine vector of financial autonomy and flexibility. Public indebtedness also constitutes an inherent act of trust and solidarity between the constitutive units of a polity, projects this polity in a longer-term perspective and give it deeper meaning and purpose. And economic historians have long shown that public debt has acted in Europe and elsewhere as a crucial factor of state building. Now, when it comes to the Union, its power to issue debt is quite paradoxical. Unlike many national constitutions, the current EU treaties nowhere expressly confer this prerogative upon the Union. Interestingly, the European Coal and Steel Community Treaty and the Euratom Treaty did explicitly consecrate a power to incur debt, but such a clause did not find its way into the Rome Treaty. However, despite such silence, a systemic reading of the EU treaties and of relevant secondary law, conducted in the light of the doctrine of implied powers and further informed by the EU's practice, clearly indicates that the EU is endowed with the power to borrow. The EU has indeed long been present on international capital markets. However, until recently, this presence was relatively discreet. The instruments such as the Community Loan Mechanism, the Balance of Payment Facility, or later the European Financial Stabilization Mechanisms, EU borrowings were limited in size, focused on country-specific crisis management, and exclusively intended for back-to-back lending purposes. Now, as Alberto has already evoked it, the COVID-19 pandemic was a real turning point, a critical juncture, some might say, for EU debt and joint borrowings. First, in purely quantitative terms, the Union borrowing activity entered with the combined effect of SURE and NextGenerationEU into a new dimension. Second, and this has already been mentioned by Alberto, the financial logic of EU borrowings also dramatically evolved. For the first time, borrowing was indeed not only mobilized for lending, but also for spending to directly finance expenditures by the member states under dedicated EU budgetary programs. And this naturally gives EU debt a deeper redistributive effect, and it gives financial solidarity in Europe a whole new meaning. Last but not least, the broader political purpose served by EU debt was also reshaped along the way. Borrowings are still framed as a crisis management tool, mobilized to offer an immediate short-term macroeconomic reaction to a sudden shock. And this crisis narrative was key in the political and legal construction of SURE and NGEU. But with SURE, and even more so with NGEU, debt took on, next to its short-term stabilizing function, another longer-term transformative role as a powerful lever for change to act on the socio-economic structures of the EU, and in the case of NGEU, to fund reforms and investments to accelerate the green and digital transition on the continent. Now, NGEU and its debt-based architecture were officially conceived as a one-off initiative, justified by the exceptionality of the pandemic, but also limited, at least formally, to that specific sequence. It was officially not meant to be reproduced, nor to be made permanent. But the EU is an inherently path-dependent polity, and more often than not, economic, political, and legal constructions born out of crisis tend to outlive the specific set of events which brought them about and become entrenched in the system. And the experience of the past few years indicates that this is precisely what is happening in the case of EU borrowings. In 2023, only 2 years after the establishment of NextGenerationEU, the EU adopted the REPowerEU initiative in reaction to the war of aggression in Ukraine, and the EU enabled to reallocate a substantial portion of NGEU borrowings to fund projects and investments enhancing the resilience, security, and sustainability of the Union's energy system. Under the macro-financial assistance mechanism first, then under the new Ukraine facility established in 2024, the EU has authorized joint borrowings for up to 80 billion euros to provide financial assistance to Ukraine. Confronted to an unprecedented challenge to its defense and security architecture, the EU adopted last May the SAFE instrument, endowed with 150 billion euros to be borrowed by the Commission. SAFE is to support member states with loans backed by the EU budget to be invested in critical defense products and infrastructure. Last but not least, and this has too been mentioned by Alberto, in its July package on the 2028-2034 multi-annual financial framework, the Commission has proposed to set up a new permanent extraordinary crisis tool endowed with a borrowing capacity of up to 400 billion euros to provide loans to member states. The tool, directly enshrined in the next own resources decision, would be activated by the Council upon the consent of the European Parliament through an implementing regulation adopted under Article 311, paragraph 4. Now, each of these instruments has its own features and its own specificities, and none of them perfectly replicates the template of NGEU. However, these developments signal that common debt has gained a new centrality, a new normality in the EU polity as a vector of public action and as a new source of financial autonomy. Borrowings now form an essential component of the EU's policy toolbox and of its public finances system. And recent developments showed the Union's readiness to mobilize them to the fullest extent possible within the limits set by the EU treaties. Now, if common debt constitutes a new vector of budgetary and political autonomy, it also presents its own challenges and pitfalls. It thereby also stands as a potential source of vulnerability. And that is what I would like to touch upon in the last minutes remaining. Now, this vulnerability takes on many forms. It is in part legal, as the exact status of common debt under EU budgetary law, its relationship with the system of own resources, and its compatibility with key principles of EU public finances is still subject to debate and disagreement. This vulnerability is also institutional. Because of its specificities, EU debt partly bypasses the ordinary budgetary procedures, and it has a disruptive effect on the institutional equilibria and compromises which underlie these procedures. Similarly, the rise of EU debt has come together with the development of new institutional arrangements, strategies, practices within the Commission, which altogether are constitutive of an EU treasury in the making. And this embryo of treasury raises its own issues in terms of accountability, of transparency, and of effectiveness. But first and foremost, the vulnerability generated by EU debt is financial. Like any other, EU public debts will eventually need to be repaid. And the ability of the EU to service its debt will be a major challenge for the years to come. It's not only a matter of contractual commitment. Market confidence, the liquidity and safety of EU debt instruments, and ultimately the long-term political viability of EU debt as a policy tool hang in the balance. Under the next MFF cycle, the EU will start repaying NGEU debts by 25 billion euros a year on average. So this roughly represents a seventh of the EU's annual budget in 2024. If the EU does not manage to find new financial means to service its debt, other budgetary items and programs will need to be reduced accordingly, and EU debt will end up, quite paradoxically, harming EU budgetary autonomy on the long term. Now, as you all know, under the funding compromise struck in the July 2020 European Council, NGEU debt is to be repaid through new own resources. The December 2020 own resources decision introduced a new own resource on non-recycled plastic packaging waste, and concomitantly, the Parliament, the Council, and the European Commission adopted, also in December 2020, an interinstitutional agreement setting out an ambitious roadmap towards the introduction of new own resources, such as a digital levy or a financial transaction tax. Now, the hope then, in both institutional and academic circles, was that EU debt would unlock the long-standing debate on own resources by giving it a new sense of political and financial urgency. Now, 5 years later, these expectations appear rather disappointed. I mean, overall progress has been limited, and on key files, negotiations have stalled. Now, with the start of debt repayments around the corner, the EU finds itself with the back against the wall, and it must consider future avenues. Now, a substantial increase of GNI-based contribution is at this stage a political no-go. Rolling over part of EU debt would be legally feasible, but is politically costly and at the moment is not being seriously considered. On the contrary, the European Commission is currently seeking to give new impetus to the discussion on own resources and hopes to make a breakthrough in the context of the next MFF negotiations. This has too been evoked by Alberto in the July proposal. The Commission puts forward 3 new own resources on non-collected e-waste, on tobacco consumption, and most importantly, on corporate income, the so-called corporate resource for Europe core. Now, these are very ambitious proposals, which signal a bold and far-reaching use of Article 311. They signal also a more political and strategic approach to own resources. Nonetheless, there is a number of important questions. First, these proposals will certainly reopen the difficult debate of the limits of Article 311. Can the provision form the basis for genuine taxing powers? Where does the limit lie between an own resource and a tax? My very preliminary assessment is that the proposed new levies would remain within the confines of Article 311 and would not formally constitute proper taxes. They do present, especially core, a certain number of tax-like features, but they fail to establish a direct and automatic link between the EU and private legal subjects the way a genuine tax would. Technically, the ORD is still addressed to the member states, and it limits itself to distributing a financial burden among them. Second, these proposals also beg the question of the relationship between Article 311 and other treaty provisions, starting with the EU's fiscal harmonization power enshrined in Article 113 and 115, and the broader regulatory competences of the EU. Can Article 311 be mobilized by its own, or should it be used in combination with other treaty bases? Lastly, these developments also raise institutional reflections. As we are witnessing a bold and far-reaching mobilization of Article 311, one should keep in mind that the procedure set by this provision largely marginalizes the EP and is strongly dominated by member states through unanimity in the Council first, and then through national ratification. So one might therefore legitimately wonder if this provision on its own forms the ideal basis for the development of the EU's fiscal power. Now, to conclude, I would like, and that will not be a surprise considering the topic I'm touching upon, I would like to convey Alexander Hamilton. And in 1781, Hamilton, who was still one of the aides-de-camp of George Washington, he was probably already preparing his political career, but then he was still in the military. He wrote to Robert Morris, superintendent of finances, the following sentence: national debt, if it is not excessive, will be to us a national blessing. It will be powerful cement of our union. Now, over the past few years, we have witnessed both a quantitative and qualitative transformation of the European Union borrowing activities. I've tried to argue that common debt can constitute a vector of financial and political autonomy. For the EU too, debt could be a cement and could substantially enhance its cohesion and its ability to project itself in the future as a polity. But debt is also a potential source of vulnerability. EU debt can only be a blessing if properly serviced through newly established financial resources. Over the past 5 years, the EU has built a strong and credible power to borrow and issue debt. Now it must make equivalent progress on its ability to deal with the legacy of that debt by raising new revenues. Here lies the key challenge for the coming months and years. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Paul. So we will soon see you as the new Hamilton in the uniform of the European Army to write to our leaders about the need for common debt. No, thanks a lot for this very nice discussion of the various aspects, the various legal and institutional aspects of raising debt. I think we will now turn to the other side, namely to the spending side of the EU's funding, EU's budget, with the presentation by Cristina Fasone. Cristina, you've got the floor.
Thanks very much to the organizers for the kind invitation. It's a real honor to be here and to share some thought on the autonomy of the EU spending side, especially following the very insightful presentation by the two previous speakers. So I will very briefly touch upon the continuity and discontinuity in the evolution of the EU spending powers. I will deal with the constraints, the many constraints on the EU spending powers. I will also, as the previous speakers, emphasize the COVID-19 crisis and the EU response to the COVID-19 crisis as a game changer. And I will try to develop some reflection on the evolutive interpretation of the legal basis that have paved the way to the adoption of the various measures, to then conclude also looking at what's next, so the proposal for the multiannual financial framework 2028-2034, to see where we are going, what is the criticism, potentially what are the challenges, but also the advancement, which I think are there somehow. So first of all, I think when interrogating on EU spending autonomy, it's not very easy to understand autonomous from whom. We are, of course, in front of treaties that set very ambitious aim to be fulfilled, and EU wants to become a very important geopolitical actors, and expenditures may help it fulfilling these various roles and aims. But very much our discussion is often linked to the autonomy from the member states, which are part of the picture, because the EU budget is, of course, strongly intertwined with the national budgets. But we also see that both procedurally and substantially, the EU expenditures are somehow dominated, maybe not as much as the own resources and the cycle for the own resources decision, but they are strongly dominated by member states, which are, of course, represented at EU institutional level. For the multi-annual financial framework, we have this very important requirement of unanimity. And over the last few years, we have witnessed some problems here, even in the revision of the multi-annual financial framework and in relation to the Ukraine facility in coping with the unanimity requirement. Luckily, there's no requirement for ratification of approval of the multi-annual financial framework in the various member states as there is for the own resources decision, but I mean, it's procedurally tight. And also substantially, we see that there is a long-standing battle, especially in between the European Parliament and the Council, on how expenditures should be shaped, in which direction they should go, and the Council is typically trying to resist any expansion or any meaningful or substantial change in that perspective. We also have to cope with an expenditure cycle that has been described as archaic, to say at least, because back in the 1980s, Jacques Delors promoted this important setting of the multi-annual financial framework, which has ensured predictability and more continuity. But in the present situation, to have a 7-year cycle with many difficulties in amending and changing is certainly a huge constraint in a context in which the crises are unfolding without the previous one being solved and fixed. And still, national budgets and the EU budget are very much intertwined. Paul mentioned the just retour logic. We also have logic on the other way, in the sense that the Stability and Growth Pact certainly links the functioning of national budget to the sustainability and the stability of the economic and monetary union, so it goes both ways. And ultimately, we have, as has been already mentioned, a lot of troubles in managing ordinary times, if any, through emergency measures and the other way around, notably to adopt emergency frame that can potentially could endure, at least as a model, if we look at the IRF. I can be quick on that, just to say that we are moving on the expenditure side, I think, especially after the NextGenerationEU, towards more redistribution than we used to see. Also, thanks to the internal market, the main function of the EU budget used to be allocation in the first place. Then, thanks to the economic and monetary union, we try to navigate stabilization with also many problems that the euro area crisis exposed. And probably since the NextGenerationEU, there is an element of redistribution, and I would say even solidarity, which, by the way, in the famous twin judgments on the rule of law conditionality was highlighted, the budget as an instrument of to make the value of solidarity tangible. So I think that's quite important, but it's a big change in the way we look at the EU budget from a theoretical perspective and then from a practical perspective also. It's also true that the multi-annual financial framework has ensured great predictability over time, maybe even a bit too much, especially when we have to cope with crises. And the rate of conflicts, even interinstitutional conflicts, had increased over the annual budget, especially after Lisbon, when the traditional divide between compulsory and non-compulsory expenditures has been overcome. So now the European Parliament and the Council are really called to agree on any single item of expenditures, and this has increased the rate of conflict. I also think that we have learned something from the European response to the euro area crisis, and the NextGenerationEU is a sign of this learning process in action. At the same time, we are coping with a budgetary galaxy. It's plenty of, I think the European Court of Auditors spoke of a financial patchwork, to refer to the EU budget, with many crucial instruments, including the European Peace Facility that was mentioned before, that is placed outside the budget, with important consequences in terms of control and oversight and of interinstitutional balance, I would say. Because in principle, the European Parliament and the Council are budgetary authorities, but in practice we see a significant asymmetry between the two of them, with the Commission trying to navigate and to act as an honest broker between the two. There are many constraints on the EU expenditures, some of which are enshrined in the treaties. Article 310 has been already mentioned. The principle of budgetary discipline being quite important here, because the Union, whatever act is adopted with appreciable financial implication for the budget, it needs to provide assurance that the expenditures arising from this act are capable of being financed within the limit of their own resources and the ceilings of the multiannual financial framework, which are indeed very rigid. The financial regulation, which is recalled also in Article 310, is another constraint, as well as the common provision regulation, especially for structural funds. And we have seen over the last financial period, for example, how important the enabling condition on the Charter of Fundamental Rights have been, also for the sake of the rule of law protection, maybe even more than the rule of law conditionality regulation. But very important is to highlight here that being the European Union not a sovereign entity, the European acts under the principle of conferral, for which very important is the detection of the legal basis and I would say even more so the justification provided for the choice of a specific legal basis. Famously, some scholars have highlighted that the EU, unlike the United States, lacks a general welfare clause like Article 1, Section 8 of the US Constitution. I think things need to be put a little bit in context here, and there is some space for constitutional interpretation, in the sense that, if I may do a little bit of comparison here, the general welfare clause in the United States has not always been interpreted as a general welfare clause, and we need to go back to the New Deal, to the some famous cases of the Supreme Court in the 1930s, to see a shift in the interpretation, because before, in this Hamiltonian versus Madisonian interpretation of that constitution, the US Congress was not allowed to set expenditures beyond the enumerated powers. And as that shift happened in the United States, of course, it's a more perfect union than we are. I mean, I think that maybe it used to be, I don't know. But there is some space for constitutional interpretation, and I will briefly try to elaborate on different techniques, of course, of constitutional interpretation. Another important element is the use of conditional spending. Which conditionality are we looking at? We have experienced many. We have had, for the EU internal policy, conditionality in the cohesion policy since the 1990s. Then we experienced strict conditionality as an outcome of the response to the euro area crisis. And I think this has somehow left member states, individuals probably in a bit of a shock. And we have tried to move beyond the strict interpretation of conditionality, even though there is some legal basis for that, the Pringle judgment and so on and so forth. But the NextGenerationEU has probably put forward a mainstreaming of conditional spending and conditionality in the EU across all the policy sectors, with thematic conditions, but also horizontal and cross-cutting conditions. And maybe conditionality is somehow a counterweight for the just retour logic, to a large extent. So I think here there is some advancement in terms of autonomy. The COVID-19 crisis as a game changer. Again, I think a lot has been learned from the euro area crisis. Many have written, including, of course, Bruno De Witte here, that some of the initiatives taken, in particular at the time of the Juncker Commission, like the Reform Support Program, many of which never saw the light, but contained already some ideas that, also in terms of interpretation of the legal basis, that then have paved the way to the NextGenerationEU construction. And here on the NextGenerationEU, we see some clashes in the interpretation between scholars looking at the NextGenerationEU and the IRFF in particular as an element of constitutional transformation, especially also for the interpretation of Article 125 and the no-bellight clause, or a case of interpretive overstretching that go up to almost a violation of the treaty provision. Well, I think I stand somehow in between, and I don't think there was any violation of the treaty provision. There has certainly been an evolutive interpretation of the treaty, but again, it really much depends on the methods of constitutional interpretation we use. We have many, textualism, originalism, but also purposive interpretation or systematic interpretation, which I think by far has been, these two have been the most widespread when we look at the interpretation of EU law. However, some question marks I just want to put forward for the discussion. Again, in terms of spending autonomy. I talked before about the spread of conditional spending as a vehicle to steer national policies and structural reforms. At the same time, it's also true that since the IRF model has been adopted somehow, we have a lot of insistence on the planning method, but especially on national planning. National planning, bilateral negotiation between the Commission and national governments, which somehow seems to instill or to push back some national logics on the way the EU expenditures are carried out. So we have this tension between these two trends, which I think is further confirmed by the new multi-annual financial framework proposal. Going to the quickly to the basis. Well, we have a nice Article 322 of the TFU, which is a general clause for the implementation of the EU budget, and it provides the basis for the financial regulation up to the rule of law conditionality regulation, even though that was contested. Article 122, with these two quite different paragraphs, have provided the basis, as we know, for the adoption of the European Union Recovery Instrument, which granted the resources through the own resources decision for the IRF. And the EU institutions made the choice to use both paragraphs together, even though scholars highlighted that the two paragraphs are quite different in their scope, and also in the way they can deal with emergency, in the sense that the second paragraph looks like an emergential clause, the reference to the exceptional occurrences, but also to the conditions for providing somehow financial assistance. And many have claimed that this clause has been used to set up then eventually the IRF, which in itself has a different legal basis though, as an emergential measure, which is not really emergential anymore, even though it has a temporary nature, because it really covers a wide array of subject matters and policy areas, and maybe with the exception of common foreign security policy, with long-term implications in terms of structural reform. But I see here the point of the tension in using both clauses, also because I forgot to mention, but the use of this article basically marginalized the European Parliament very much, because the European Parliament is just informed. And we see the European Parliament is taking now some action to against the safe regulation, for example, to react maybe to sort of abuse of these legal basis. I think on Article 175, paragraph 3 of the TU, the flexibility clause for cohesion policy, I will be more indulgent in the sense that I think in the way this article, but also Article 174 are drafted, I see a lot of leeway for interpretation and for an evolutive interpretation. And the reasoning that has been given also for choosing this legal basis for the IRF makes a lot of sense to me, in the sense that this becomes a channel for structural reforms that then can boost the economy, and through improving the performance of the economy, we foster convergence. So I think it's not so straightforward immediately, but there is a link. What I think it will be important to strengthen more will be the oversight on the use of the legal basis, which would also maybe force the institution to better justify their decision. In terms of democratic accountability, the European Parliament is really in a weak position, and I can say also national parliaments are very much, because with all these plans, national plans going on, I don't think they're able to really exercise any meaningful scrutiny on the drafting and then on the implementation. Also, technical oversight and judicial oversight, I see here as very important the role of the European Court of Auditors, that has been repeatedly somehow putting forward alarming signals on how performative is the IRFF if we don't have, for example, clear figures on the costs. How common is the way member states put forward milestone and targets, which is a problem I think we are going to see replicated also for these new national and regional partnership plans under the future multi-annual financial framework. And ultimately, the judicial oversight of the Court of Justice, of course, even though I tend to see it as the very last resort. So as much as possible, we should try to solve things politically before going to the court. To conclude, how legitimate and autonomous is the spending capacity of the European Union? I see some advancement here in terms of spending autonomy as a consequence of the NextGenerationEU, even though we know the NextGenerationEU is temporary. But the IRF model, I think, is here to stay with this performance-based planning, the focus on bilateral negotiations. Is there a competence creep that we are experiencing? Looking back also at the NextGenerationEU, I don't think so. I think that in front of a constitution that is extremely difficult to amend, we need also to put the treaty provision in context. And even though the treaty stays back to the Lisbon Treaty, the union that we have this day is very, very different from the union that we have before the big financial crisis. And so some adaptation, lacking any prospect, I think, of treaty amendment, needs to be found. And I personally welcome an evolutive interpretation, purposive interpretation of the treaty basis, as long as there is effective democratic, technical, and judicial oversight, and also solid justification for this. So we cannot stick to textualism, even less so originalism is completely outdated and not fit for the purpose. Also, we should pay attention to the institutional balance, which is set in the treaties. Again, the European Parliament role and the growing role that the European Council was able to play over the last two cycles on the multi-annual financial framework should deserve further scrutiny. I see some problem going to transparency in the way all these negotiation on national planning and the setting of milestone and targets and their implementation is carried out. And I think those who are a bit concerned by the new prospect for cohesion policy under the proposal for the new multi-annual financial framework are to some extent right for the concern they show in terms of bottom-up participation, because here we may witness a strong centralization in the hands of the state of what used to be a process that was very participatory with stakeholders, with regional and local authorities. So there is this risk that has been already highlighted. And more flexibility. I think the proposal, as far as I could see, especially the decision to reduce the number of headings and to create this macro heading, number one, with cohesion policy, common agricultural policy, fishery policies, migration, security, to some extent reduce the overall envelope for this policy, but makes the management of the expenditures potentially more flexible. So I personally welcome this from the perspective also of the autonomy of the supranational level of government. But we end, however, with a dilemma that has not been solved yet between centralization and decentralization in the spending power. Because fiscal federalism can be shaped in very different way, more central, more in a more decentralized way. And I think the EU is not yet clear or where to go exactly on this point. Thanks very much for the attention.
Thank you, Cristina. So thanks to the three speakers, we now have a bit of time for discussion. How would it work if people want to speak? Do we need a mic? Yes, there's mics available. So who would like to intervene, including the speakers, of course, can also react to each other. So I see, let's start at the back there. Yes. And can you please present yourself when you speak?
Of course, with pleasure. My name is Marguerite O'Connell. I'm in the ECB's Legal Services. And I had a question on the topic of European public goods, and especially when we think of defence as a European public good. And my question would be, how does that fit in with the EU's budgetary autonomy? Defence, I guess, has quite a unique position within the EU's treaties. We can think of Article 41.2, which says that the EU budget cannot be used for operational expenditure. We can think of the way it's treated in the EU's competences, as in it's not. And we can think also of the way, I think the phrase European army was mentioned in passing earlier, the way that that has been rather a sensitive topic in some member states, my member state, Ireland in particular, where as a result there have been some protocols and where the CFSP has not developed like other parts of EU law. So I was wondering if you had a few more things to say about that, and especially the way the SAFE regulation was designed to work around that. Thank you.
Thanks. So we will collect a few questions first and then ask the speakers to react. Over there, two persons there.
Sure. Thank you very much, Fabian Amderbrink, Erasmus University. I was intrigued by, well, the question came up when Paul, hi Paul, you were talking about borrowing and the extent of borrowing, and Cristina who said, well, RF is here to stay. And then I was thinking, if we discuss this borrowing taxing, would it make sense to also discuss it in terms of the generational issue that is involved? So to kind of like make a maybe provocative statement or not, taxing is about letting the current generation pay, and borrowing is about letting the next generation, or shall we say when we roll over until we shall not mention countries who do that, it's the next generation, our children, grandchildren, and so forth. And maybe that is an aspect that could be interesting to bring in. And I know usually taxing loses and borrowing wins, but nevertheless.
No, thank you very much, Jen from University of Salzburg. First off, I would like to say I completely second the analysis, and that's just meant to be a little bit of a provocation. But I'm wondering whether we're not here facing a bit the dilemma between, or the risk rather, of fostering the autonomy of the European Union by all those policies, increasing budget, etc., and isolation or contestation from national parliaments in particular. We see here, in my opinion, a dynamic whereby the European Union is always more active in a variety of fields, areas which were traditionally reserved to national parliaments, be it defense and whatnot. At the same time, Cristina, you highlighted very well that, and I completely second this, that national parliaments are not really involved outside of the ratification of their own resources decision. They're not really involved in the RF development, and I would also not expect that they be very much involved in those national plans. So do we not face the risk that for the autonomy of the European Union and the need of these policies that we have contestation, growing contestation on the side of national parliaments? And if we look at the way in which national parliaments have been using the subsidiarity analysis and the other tools that they have at their disposal to enter in a relationship or in a dialogue with the European Commission in particular, we do see, I think, this threat coming. So how do we reconcile this? And is it not for the European legislator to intervene, so to say, in the institutional balance at the national level by guaranteeing more rights and prerogatives for national parliaments? Thank you.
Okay, thanks. So we'll take one more and then we will go back to the speakers. Well, we'll come back later, but let's take this person and then we'll come in the second round.
Thank you very much. So I have a question particularly for Ms. Fasone, in particular because you mentioned the EU cohesion policy, and so has a legal basis also for the Recovery and Resilience Facility. I was wondering if you consider a sort of shift in the use of EU cohesion policy, so not concerning let's say, not a centralized management, but decentralized usually, no? On the contrary, here with the recovery plans, etc., with the direct management from the European Commission, so there is a sort of shift. And also in the use of the EU cohesion policy, so of this legal basis concerning it's a real shift, for example, in the use of macroeconomic conditionality. You mentioned also macroeconomic conditionality, the stabilization functions. So all things which are, in my view, mostly related to an economic policy and not a real cohesion policy. So I would like very grateful of having your view on this. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. First reactions. Let's start with you, Cristina. You've got a few questions there.
Thanks very much for these important questions. I will start from the first question on European public good, the safe regulation and the special status on common foreign security policy. I think it is and remains very peculiar compared to other policy areas. I don't see a lot of margin for repatriating, so to say, funds like the European Peace Facility into the EU budget, because in this case, the legal constraints are very, very tough. I think in the case of the safe regulation, indeed, the use, once again, of Article 122 was a bit problematic. Of course, there is an emergency, there is a crisis there, but maybe the legal basis on common foreign security policy should have been used in this case, and also the governance of this facility that, as Bruno said, is fully funded by member states' governments, is very, very peculiar with this facility committee. So I'm not very I'm not expecting big changes in the field of common foreign security policy, even though it's the hottest part, of course. Going to the end point, isolation contestation, yes, definitely. There is a problem here, and I think European institutions could do a little bit better, also in the framework of the RFF, in treating national parliaments as institutions, because sometimes even in the IRFF regulation, they look like similar to stakeholders compared to the institutional weight that they have. That said, I think is for constitutional law to strengthen them, and we see that the position of national parliaments is very uneven. It depends a lot on the constitutional system. When we look at Finland, for example, with the Constitution Committee, or German is not certainly the situation of Italy. And in that case, constitutional law, constitutional safeguards play an important role. On cohesion policy, yes, I think we had a huge shift, and the risk and the allegation that has been put forward is that the economic policy as such has been emptied of its own beef, so to say. But I think it's also, when looking at the way the provisions are drafted, they are not so far away from economic policy when we look at, for example, Article 174. And many have claimed that Article 175, paragraph 3, does not explicitly mention, for example, financial assistance, but does not exclude it either. So I tend to be sympathetic with this interpretation. That said, there is a shift. There is a shift, probably because of the difficulty in using coordination of economic policies as a tool to make spending autonomy progress. And on Fabian, yes, I agree that there is here a different legitimacy between taxing and borrowing in terms of generational impact. So, but the difficulty seems to go also maybe more in favor of borrowing than taxing for political reasons also.
I think Cristina has been very, very thorough and exhaustive in addressing most of the questions, probably to complete her responses and a part of her very rich intervention also on the question of the public goods and defense. It's a key question. I think Article 41 of the TEU is very clear. We cannot use the budget of the Union to finance operations with military or defense implications. Now, a part of that, we've got two avenues, two evolutions in the last years. One of them is that we've used the budget of the Union to finance not that much operations having military implications, but industrial policy of the Union. It's in the EDIP, so helping companies to become more competitive when producing weaponry. And the second one is safe, it's Article 122, which is not about producing weaponry, but about acquiring weapons. And this is there where we dangerously go to the border with Article 41. Now, I can absolutely uphold the legality of the Article 122 regulation. In order to use Article 122, we need a number of conditions, which are very strict. It cannot be abused, as you say, Cristina, but we must be in face of a existential economic crisis, but economic crisis. So the question is whether in a context where the budget of the member states will have to be reoriented at least up to 5% to a defense economy, it is conceivable to use Article 122 to help member states to make this economic readaptation. And one cannot forget that 122 was activated or adopted the very week when the escape clause, suspension of the Stability and Growth Pact for defense expenditure, was also activated, which further reaffirms the economic rationale of the Article 122 safe proposal. Yet we are going to have a very interesting case before the Court of Justice because the Parliament has contested legality of this regulation before the court. We will see. On, I think, Diane, you put a question on the dilemma, the role with national parliaments. I think there were also some criticisms echoed by Cristina on how national parliaments are treated or considered inter alia ref and budgetary autonomy of the Union, this tension between the two. I have to say something, which is, to the extent we are operating fundamentally in the own resources logic, The role of the national parliaments cannot be but enhanced. We introduced Next Generation and RF with own resources, which means that we go to the European Council, which means that all the 27 prime ministers, they should be subject to a parliamentary national control before engaging to what they do. Once agreed, it goes to national parliaments for ratification, which is a very interesting question when it comes about the introduction of taxes. No taxation without representation. Do not forget that own resources guarantees the intervention of national parliaments. With this, I would like to indicate that 311 may be an interesting legal basis to explore in the future to do so. When it comes to RRF, it's true, I'm not very much aware the manner how national parliaments are treated by the Commission, yet it is true that in RRF, there is a big ownership embedded in the idea of the regulation, that it is a quasi-contractual logic where national parliaments submit their plans to the Commission and they are approved. So there is a very important national ownership from that point of view. And finally, to close, this question of Article 175.3, cohesion, economic policy, etc. Two very fast comments. The first one is that I think it's Article 174, which says when designing the economic policy, the cohesion policy of the Union, you shall take into account the economic policy of the Union. You shall take into account the European semester. So the manner to bring about cohesion is reflecting convergence as agreed in economic governance. So there are communicating vessels between the two. This is the first thing I would like to say. Something which is explained, if you have a look to the protocol on cohesion, which is primary law, which is annexed to the treaties, you see very well reflected that cohesion was introduced back in the 90s with this famous agreement between Kohl, Mitterrand, and Felipe González to compensate the efforts of member states towards convergence because of the introduction of the euro. And it is reflected there, which in turn justifies the economic governance conditionality that you find in cohesion. So I wanted to say, yes, cohesion is there, but cohesion is strongly connected to the economic policy of the Union. This is why we pour the content of the European semester in the RRF plans. But I will leave it by here. I leave the most complicated question on borrowing and taxing to Paul.
Thanks a lot for these questions, and I'll be just complimenting Alberto's and Cristina's reactions on questions.
Mike.
Oh, sorry. On the question of defense and safe, so indeed the legal basis is controversial. We have a case. Some people might say that this is a wrong case, that the Parliament shouldn't have gone to the Court of Justice. But at least we'll have some legal certainty. And I think it's healthy for the EU legal order to have some judicial clarity when it comes to that provision, which has been mobilized over and over again by the EU. So at least now we'll have a bit of a clear idea of what this emergency clause allows and what the limits are. Also, when it comes to European public goods, and I think it's a more general question of the extent to which borrowings do actually finance European public goods. And this is a criticism that came up also recurrently when it comes to NGEU, people arguing that in the end, that common money was used to fund national projects, very often projects that had been there in the boxes and then in the files for years, and suddenly member states managed to find the money to fund it. But that these projects did not really have a transnational, generally European dimension. For SAFE, the debate came back, and there are a number of safeguards which are foreseen to ensure the collective nature of what is being funded, to also ensure the truly European nature of the equipment which is being acquired, and that from a European public goods perspective is welcome. And on the question of the generational dimension of the issue of taxing and borrowing, it's a great reflection, Fabian. And indeed, I think the EU now has to grapple with these issues, which are classic in member states, which are new to the European Union. Indeed, borrowing from a generational perspective is easier than taxing, and so indeed it's about finding the proper balance. In a way, we've done the easy part, and now we'll have to start doing maybe the more complicated part from a political perspective.
It's 1 o'clock, but can we have 5 or 10 more minutes? Okay, because there were more questions. Yes. There's no mics anymore. It's coming. And are there more persons who want to intervene? No, that's it. Okay, fine.
Thank you. I'm Renato Mangano, University of Palermo. And I have a general question that for the sake of convenience might be addressed to Alberto. So I think that the most important lesson that we learned from the pandemic was a lesson on governance, a lesson on how to aggregate consensus. So I was wondering if now we have to shift from a perspective that focus merely on constraints, legal basis, to a perspective that focuses mainly on governance, on the way we are able to resolve the tensions between EU and member states and the difference between the different member states. Thank you.
One more question. Who was it? Yes, Emmanuel.
Yes, Emanuele Bassi from the Council Legal Service. I am a comment and a question. The comment concerns this debate that has already started concerning the current pending litigation on the safe regulation and relationship between 122 and Article 40. Well, unfortunately, this aspect will not very much to be discussed in front of the court because the Parliament has not put this element as part of the application. And you can understand well why, because it's something to lose if by chance it's considered that 40 or 41 would be more relevant. But in that regard, apart from the very pertinent observation on industrial policy dimension that Alberto was already stressing, I would just attract your attention on the fact that Article 122 refers to treaties in plural, in defining the relationship between emergency competence and substantive competence, without prejudice to other provision in the treaties. And treaties plural means treaties on the functioning and treaties on the union. So this is an element that may be taken into account when assessing the relationship between Article 40 and Article 122 in the very specific context of an emergency measure based on that provision. And my question is one about interpretative criteria. In the moment where autonomy is becoming, as recognized by the court, a principle of the union, of the legal order of the union, which is, according to you, the kind of implication we can draw while using this principle in interpreting other provisions of the treaties? And I think that this may be very much relevant on the debate on the legal basis of spending, for instance, is 175 and the very narrow interpretation that the scholars are upholding. But I'm wondering whether you can even use it on the side of the revenue. And in general, in all other debates we're going to have in these days. So which is the constitutional, let's say, spin that this recognition entails for the lawyer?
Okay. You want to start?
So I can start with the question on governance, which is a very good one and a very topical and typical question we have now on the table. It's a question which we see in many fields, not only in the field of budget. We fight almost on a monthly basis with unanimity, with consensus in very existential decisions. I can tell to you how uphill it is to renovate sanctions to Russia every 6 months, which are held to unanimity, just to put to you an example. Which brings us to a very much wider question, which is the absorption capacity of the union in view of the enlargement. Can we continue with having recourse to unanimity and consensus in some of the most existential areas in an union where it will not only have 27 member states, but 30 plus? And how can we bypass this? In the particular field of budget, I think it is very clear that MFF and own resources have to undergo unanimity. In the case of own resources, the ratification by national parliaments. That's unavoidable, and that will create tensions, and it's a very difficult and painful via crucis of negotiations that will take 2 years. What is probably more important is to be clear that once agreed, setting in motion what has been agreed should not be kidnapped by the logic of unanimity and consensus. And I go back to the experience of Next Generation, where the discussion at the level of the European Council at that time between Prime Minister Rutte and Prime Minister Conte was indeed about this. Do we set in motion RRF by unanimity, a sort of ESM-like conditionality, with the men in black going to member states and the Netherlands or Germany having the capacity to block the release of funds? Or do we rely on the logic of qualified majority, because at the end of the day, what we are doing is cohesion policy? This is why the legal base is so important. You know what was the final result. The final result was the decision-making governance is qualified majority for approving the plans, and the Commission then decides on paying the different tranches. So it's a very important question which will resurface, no doubt, in the new budgetary cycle. But the position of the lawyers of the institutions is to minimize recourse to unanimity to the minimum possible, as indicated by the treaties. I will leave it by there. The question on interpretation, there are much more qualified constitutional lawyers on this table to address it. I'm looking at the right and left.
Let's ask Cristina.
Thanks for this question, which is a very complex one, so I have to think more about that. But as a first reaction, I think a claim for legal autonomy may be accompanied by a follow-up in terms of interpretation that is less subject to straitjacket of literal interpretation, originalist imprinting, even though I don't think that in the EU there is a wide use of this technique. I'm saying this just because the path I've seen in federalizing processes, once there is a bold claim for more autonomy coming from the federal institution, has been accompanied, but then federalizing processes are always in flux, so we have moments of expansion and moments of entrenchment, has been accompanied by a more living tree understanding of a constitution, of a treaty basis, with all the caveats we need to have in the case of the European Union because of this principle of conferral. But interrogating myself about this comparison between the US and the European Union, aren't the enumerated powers under Article 1, Section 8, principle of conferral in the US terms? So maybe I'm going too beyond, but I think the spin will be to pave the way for a more evolutive, purposive style of interpretation, potentially.
Very, very briefly to Emanuele's question, very interesting point to which I should reflect certainly more. But my initial reaction would be that the court relies on teleological interpretation, purposive interpretation all the time, and certainly autonomy could be fed into this kind of interpretation. We know that at the moment the dominating narrative is one of solidarity, and we know where that comes from, and a certain number of judges on the bench have developed a strong narrative of solidarity, but certainly a new narrative based on autonomy, legal, but also potentially financial and economic, could also be developed to feed the interpretations of the court.
Okay, thanks a lot. I think we had an interesting and very broad-ranging debate. I just want to finish by mentioning 3 letters which have not been used, letters E, C, and B. Nobody mentioned ECB. Whereas we know that the ECB also does governing through funding, you know, the green monetary policy and things like that. It's interesting because, and it's I think it indicates that the ECB is on a different planet from the other institutions. So we look at interaction between institutions and of the EU and with the national parliaments and everything. And then we have the ECB, which is also having its own budgetary autonomy, if you could say so. But that's a different story. Maybe we'll discuss that on some other occasion. So thanks a lot to everybody. And now it's time for lunch, I think.